Vic Dominguez. How are you?
I am great, thank you.
Wonderful. You started the Idaho ICAC Coalition over a decade ago. You have a very successful career in law enforcement. You moved to Idaho. You understand the nature and the risk of internet crimes against children, which is what ICAC stands for. And because of that, you started this coalition to try to help contribute to the education and education of parents, and then obviously prosecution of perpetrators. We're here today. You guys have been at it for a long time. You raise money, you train individuals, you train detectives across the state of Idaho and help contribute to offices and departments. I love this. I love it. I'm really excited to have you on. Talk to me how you got into this.
Well, thank you. And first of all, as much as I appreciate you giving me the credit, I will say that when I moved here, my hope was to retire from law enforcement. Of course, after I got here, I realized that I didn't hunt, fish, or camp. So I decided to join the Boise Rotary Club, which I was a member of the Rotary Club in California. And the truth of the matter on the coalition is that at one of our meetings, we had a presentation from the two detectives of the Boise Police Department who are actually involved in investigating these types of cases. And they put on a wonderful presentation, very informative. And interestingly enough, they passed out little envelopes on all the tables. And they had established a nonprofit. It wasn't called we call it today. It wasn't ICAC in the sense of the coalition, but they were the ones who originally had tried to set this up to make it something that they could use as an additional tool with the cases they were dealing with. So the two detectives were Tim Brady and Jason Petersak. Wonderful guys. They had the idea. As the meeting concluded, and it was very apparent that nobody put anything in any of the envelopes, and that when I looked at the presentation they made, which again was very informative and very interesting, the typical problem with law enforcement officers is it's very hard for us to be comfortable asking for money or funding in any way, in spite of the merits of what it is that we're promoting and soliciting the funding for. So truthfully, in looking back on it, I didn't even recall anywhere in their presentation that they said, oh, by the way, we're a nonprofit. If you would donate, that would be great. We have envelopes on the table. So I had significant experience with nonprofits and with, I was even on our Police Activities League board. I was the president back in Anaheim. And so I walked out to him, and I'll try to make this a shorter story.
Listen, we got all the time we need. Don't you worry about it.
Well, and the only reason I'm going into some detail, frankly, is because I want to be clear that I did not start out doing this. But once they shared what they shared with me about what was occurring, and it was a real eye-opener for me, because I'm thinking, compared to California, I'm in paradise. There's no crime out here. And keep in mind, again, this was 12 years ago when I first moved out. So it was hard to realize that level of activity was going on in relationship to internet crimes against children, even here in Idaho. So we sat down, the three of us, and then ultimately I solicited volunteers from the Rotary Club to be an acting board. And we created what you see today, the Idaho Internet Crimes Against Children Coalition. We jointly created the logo. We jointly established what the guidelines were and how we would move forward from there. And so at every turn, law enforcement was involved with its establishment as a nonprofit. And then unfortunately they got reassigned, and there was some internal things going on with the department, and they had to pull back. And so I just took it over and carried it on. And it was a real growth process, because even some of our original board members, I found myself having to think and say, maybe this isn't for you. If you're not prepared to roll up your sleeves, we need the help. And so we wound up going through a number of individuals on our board, and this is what it's taken over 10 years to get to where we are now. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, the the nature of internet crimes. I mean, crimes have been being perpetrated on the internet pretty much since it started, right?
Right.
But the nature of them changed around the 2010, 11, 12 timeframe. I believe obviously the iPhone comes out in 2007, 2008. And then you have the App Store that gets published, starts getting utilized right around that time frame, 2011, 2012. I actually knew a guy, I was neighbors with a guy who was an app developer. And he was talking about the Wild West of the App Store. He's like, you don't understand. You can do anything. I'm like, okay, I don't really understand. Like, I can also buy bagels. Like, what do you mean I can do anything? And his emphasis was like, listen, there are no restrictions on what kind of apps you can make. There are no restrictions on what you can do for entertainment. And he was doing very innocuous apps. So he had one that he had designed that apparently did pretty well, which was like a little gerbil, like a video of a gerbil. And you say something and then the gerbil repeats what you said. Like they record it and modify it. And then the gerbil, and apparently kids love doing it. So they'd say things, no problem. They'd say things into the phone all day long and watch this little gerbil repeat it back, right? But it also opened up communication mechanisms and started connecting people with random. We started making these apps that were specifically designed to connect unvetted, random, geographically perhaps removed or close proximity individuals at a scale and in a manner that we never had in the history of humanity.
Right, right. I mean, absolutely. I think certainly since the time I first started my involvement with this subject matter and even the information that Tim and Jason had, this issue has evolved significantly. And what I found was not only was it a priority to make sure that we had active, supportive, involved board members, but that we stayed on the cutting edge of whatever the developments were as it related to not just apps, but any form of internet crime against a child. And it did evolve, and it did turn into something where every time we found out something new, we had to research it, and we had to look at it from the standpoint of how do we best address this when we go out and present to the public. And fortunately, some of our board members were working law enforcement officers who were actively involved still in the field, and their input was invaluable. So we built a strategy around that, and that's how we evolved into doing more than just doing presentations, which was what we were originally doing to the public. And you have to look at what is going on in the state of Idaho and what is going on in the state of Idaho law enforcement specific to this type of criminal activity. And as new as we were to it and as active as we were trying to be in terms of researching it and coming up with efforts to address those issues, law enforcement by and large was not doing that. In fact, to this day, it's my understanding that the basic academy that is offered to law enforcement doesn't even have a 1-hour class presented to incoming officers about this subject. It's just not addressed. So training when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to understanding the dynamic, when it comes to understanding how to proceed even from the get-go in terms of investigations and handling the victim and handling the victim's family, we developed all of that. And that's why we've put on several classes now, and they've all been very well attended. And we continue to move down that road to help. And by the way, we do this all cost-free, and we do it in a way that we try to geographically locate it where it's most convenient for our agencies that we're trying to address. But the point is that it's well attended because there is no other form of training for law enforcement. But we approach it right from the get-go of first responders. You get a call at a home, the mothers or the fathers standing there saying, this is what's going on with my kid. what do we need to do, and what are you going to do? And there was an attitude at one time that had been expressed that, well, unless the predator actually makes physical contact with your child, there's nothing we can do. And we knew that wasn't the case. There was statutes in place to address these types of grooming and communications online. And but in fairness to law enforcement, they didn't know about that. They didn't have that information. So I don't mean to go on and on, but that was something we felt we needed to address, and we did through this training.
But again, you're not going on and on. The thing that I find, this type of crime is very unique, at least from what I've learned over the last, let's say year,
Right.
In trying to work with my school board and different law enforcement agencies and whatnot. There are a couple things that jump out. One, this is one of the only types of large scale scams or crimes that is very honed in on teen boys. When I was 16, nobody really worried about, yeah, you don't want me to get kidnapped or something, but it was nothing like, oh, I have to worry. We've always worried about our young women, as we should. And
Sure.
we do today. We did 100 years ago. We always should. But a 16-year-old boy, there was no large scale, effective, repeatable scam that were like, okay, let's target the 16-year-old dudes. Internet crimes against teen boys are rampant.
Yeah.
And it's the first time when we really had to back up and say, like, okay, how do we protect our young men against their more base selves, right? Like, all you need is a little pornography and access to them on some social media app, and you can likely get something that you can extort them with very quickly. That to me seems wild. The other thing is that the laws around this, first off, the actual scams and technologies are changing so rapidly, and then the laws trailing them change less rapidly, but they are trailing, right? It takes time to change the laws. And then the actual implementation throughout law enforcement, even with existing things, lags behind that. So you have this like horrendous dragon that's wreaking all this havoc, and then like way, way back down the tails, here's law enforcement doing the best they can, right? It's not that they're, and the detachment of geographic proximity and universality of the crimes, meaning somebody in a very, very rural place in Idaho that may not see the same kind of gang crime or drug crime or something like that could fall prey to the exact same internet crimes that somebody in, say, Boise, encounters.
Absolutely.
You put those things together and it's like, okay, it's attacking a vulnerable group that we've never considered a vulnerable group before.
Right.
It's the laws and statutes and implementation of those laws are lagging behind. And it could attack anyone anywhere. It's not like, the kid in her room in Salmon, Idaho is no safer than the kid in the room in Boise. Right. It's that kind of stuff. Like how is law enforcement responding to this? And obviously your group is going out and trying to train people, but is there an acknowledgement that it's like, okay, we're kind of dealing with a different category of crime?
Well, there's no question that in general, it requires a certain level of sophistication by law enforcement, their administrations, their departments, to even acknowledge that this is a significant crime and it exists in Idaho, and it could very well exist in the smallest of communities in Idaho, and that we need to be on the cutting edge and be proactive in terms of what we do as law enforcement, even in our small community. Because frankly, not only do we find victims that are being victimized in those smaller communities, but many times our predators come from some of those smaller communities. So, there's a lot going on in a small community that's predominantly rural, and that most people have a level of trust and confidence that we don't have any crime here. I mean, we encountered that attitude even as we went down this road with the state of Idaho. Idaho citizens were resistant to the idea that this type of criminal activity goes on in Idaho. That they were focused on, this probably happens in California, New York, Chicago, but not in Idaho. So we had to really impress on them that yes, it does happen in Idaho. It happens a lot more in Idaho than you realize, and that it is important that you pay attention and that you do what you can to protect the children. And that's the other part of our focus is that, unfortunately, as you can imagine, when you talk about the nature of the crime and you talk about whether it's sextortion or whether it's cyberbullying or whether it's because a lot of this is kid to kid, but all of the predatory activity that goes on the internet, I think that when you tell parents that you need to take the lead on trying to prevent your child from being a victim, there's no question that they have that responsibility. But you also have to present it in a way that they feel there are practical ways to be able to be proactive in protecting their children without having to become an expert in computer science, without having to become an expert in the apps, because many times I think that that's what happens. Parents get intimidated by all of that, and they kind of, even if they're concerned and aware, sort of cross their fingers and say, well, hopefully I raise my kid properly. They'll never do this or do that. And it has to go beyond that. You have to really make them feel that they do have methods and approaches that are realistic, that are not overly complicated. They do not have to have that kind of expertise, and they can still be a very effective deterrent for their kids getting victimized. And that's the thing we always say, and I've got to be honest with you. I know there's a tendency to blame the parent and say, well, if the parent did more, if the parent did enough, if the parent had an environment where their kids felt protected and healthy and there were no issues with their children, then they wouldn't have these concerns. But kids are still kids. Teenagers are still teenagers. Right. And you can't create an environment completely where you can say, okay, I've done the best job I can do to raise them, and now I have to count on that as the way to depend on them to not do what other kids are doing.
If I may, to this point, one thing I emphasized, I did a presentation for the Nampa School Board earlier this week, and one thing I was emphasizing is, listen, we can talk to parents about practical stuff, right? And you can talk to kids, you can try to educate kids. This is one of the big things. A lot of times when people talk about educating and prevention, a lot of things are child facing. When they're like, okay, let's educate the 14-year-old or let's educate the 12-year-old, talk about the risks of pornography, all these, that's all well and fine.
Right.
When I was 16 though, I had a champagne colored 1988 Honda Accord.
Ooh.
Oh, watch out, baby.
Lucky you.
Front wheel drive. It was manual.
Yeah.
So man, I did burnouts in that car. I destroyed the clutch, right? It had like 4 horsepower, right? It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I knew I was wrong. Like there was no question in my head that doing a burnout on, Clayton Road was a bad idea.
Right.
I could not help it though.
Oh, of course.
And what I tell people is like, listen, if I had a Porsche 911, I would be dead. It doesn't matter what education you gave me. It doesn't matter like all of those, nothing. You could have put a don't kill yourself sticker on the steering wheel and my face would have landed on it. Right. And the emphasis is like, listen, at some point, right? Like parents need to talk to their kids and that's fine. But the parents also need other practical tools and mechanisms in place to protect their kids.
Absolutely.
That aren't just like, well, I've talked to them.
Right.
It's like you could have said anything you wanted. It would never have mattered to me.
Absolutely.
And so again, I think there is this shift of, okay, let's give parents practical tools that go beyond. Everybody always says, talk to your kids. And yeah, I talk to my kid too. I have a 7th grader, drive him to school every morning. And this was a great win for me. About a week ago, he told me, he said, hey, look, Dad, I want to tell you something. And I was like, oh no. Oh, here it comes. And he said, listen, I can watch any YouTube video I want on my computer, my school computer. I was like, okay, your computer has Go Guardian. So I'm not mad. It's like, thank you for telling me. Show me. So we're in the car and we're just in stop and go traffic. He grabs his computer. We tether it to my phone. And He's like, watch. Within 30 seconds, he just pulls up YouTube and he looks up he really likes Star Wars. And so he looks up the Star Wars video game YouTube video. And the monitoring system on the computer blurs it out, right? And he's like, okay, so I can't watch it on YouTube. I'm like, okay, yep, well, what do you do now? He copies the URL, opens PowerPoint, goes to insert URL, and pastes the URL, and boom, the video starts playing instantly. And then, of course, had recommended videos after that.
Right.
And you know, the mechanics of that are obviously two unrelated platforms that aren't communicating, that aren't blah, blah, blah. The monitoring system didn't catch it. I thought that was such a great win from like, okay, I've talked to my son. He feels comfortable. He realizes he can do this thing. He doesn't like it, or he at least knows it's wrong and he wants to share that with me. I thought that was a great win.
Absolutely.
But you're kidding yourself if you think he hasn't watched those Star Wars videos. Like, he tells me, but he's still going to do it, right? So even with that gigantic win that I thought was a win, with me talking to my kid and he tells me, I still know he's doing it, right? And if he's not doing it, he's still watching it on his friend's computer who did it, or these other things. So yeah, having that practical, implementable, is that a word? Thing you can implement, whatever.
You can say it works for me. Yeah.
Those types of things for parents, it's like, listen, there's only so much. There's only so much you can do. And then they need real hard and fast stops.
They do. And again, I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I'm not trying to say that regardless of the parental influence that that kids are going to get in trouble or not going to get in trouble. I think there's no question that the home environment plays a big part of this. But I also think that it's a societal issue because, well, now I'm going to really date myself. But, when I was a kid and my parents would come home from work, the first thing they wanted to do was to make sure I was planted in front of the television watching kids' shows while they relaxed and maybe had a cocktail and maybe sat back and made some conversation. And so the need to be able to avoid coming home and immediately being confronted with kids that are wanting your attention, it happens. And so, but I also think it's a matter of degree. Okay, take that time. But for example, I know personally a family who, when they get home and their son has a computer upstairs, the first thing they say is, well, go upstairs and play with your computer. And they have no responsibility as far as they're concerned about what's he doing up there on that computer, as long as he's out of their hair. And so, yes, parents, and we tell this as firmly as we can, yes, you are still responsible for the home environment. And yes, the home environment can definitely be a factor as to whether or not your child could ultimately become a victim or a predator themselves. And so I don't want to completely let parents off the hook, but I also believe that even well-meaning parents have to be educated and told, look, okay, this is a whole new world.
Right.
And now these are the challenges you're facing, and these are the strategies that you can implement without being an expert in computer and applications, because when they start looking at it that way, it intimidates many of them. They are not as familiar with it as their kids are. And so, again, and I probably said this earlier, that there are very practical ways that parents can do things, and we share that in our presentations. I mean, just a quick example is when you go to bed at night, do not allow a device in the child's bedroom when they're supposed to be going to sleep. Put it in a central location, monitor it, and then when they get up in the morning, then they can have it back. But we've learned statistically that the majority of kids who get in trouble on the internet get in trouble between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m, which is when they're supposed to be sleeping, but their device is in there, and that's when they decide behind a closed door that they're going to really get, how should I put it, very involved and explore what they can encounter on the internet that they wouldn't be comfortable doing if they were in the presence of a parent, And so take the device away. Now, that alone, believe it or not, will cause some serious grief with your child, and you'll be accused of everything from you don't trust me,
Yeah, right.
none of my friends' parents do this, why are you doing it? But at the same time, that's probably one of the most effective ways to prevent potential victimization.
I have a friend that I just spoke to last weekend who was telling me he now stores all of the school tech and all of the personal tech in a biometric safe in his room because he even was taking it away before and putting it in his room and in other places in the house, and his kids would wait for him to go to bed and then they'd sneak in and grab it. And it's like, it's
Yeah,
unbelievable,
I know.
and he has really good kids, right? But it doesn't take a lot to imagine I'd just be dead to the world and somebody like sneaks in and grabs an
Absolutely.
iPad or a phone or anything like that. Burner phones also,
Right.
those are big things.
Right.
A question for you about, you mentioned the changing world. There there are people like you that are trying to scream from the mountaintops, hey, this is dangerous. And then there are other people in the world that are doing the exact opposite and encouraging younger people to be engaging in more social media. Now, a lot of times the organizations that I'm talking about are things like, with the changing of the rules around college sports with the name, image, likeness deals. So you have the NIL deals that are producing millions and millions of dollars for certain people.
Sure.
And by the way, the vast majority of them are women,
Right.
right? And like the highest paid NIL deal is a gal out of, I think, Georgia or something. She's a gymnast. And you go onto her Instagram page and she's paid millions of dollars a year. And she is not on there is showcasing her gymnastic talent. Like, that's just not the way it goes. But just as people are starting to realize, wow, this is really dangerous, parents are being encouraged to put their kids out there in the world to gain followings, to gain notoriety. Because guess what, Vic? Your daughter, she might be able to get a sponsorship or something like that. So she's a tennis player. She's great at tennis. Oh my gosh, you got to get her on here. And guess what? I actually, as an organization, I can help your daughter do that. Let me help you. We'll charge you guys this much. We guarantee a 10,000 person following. And these kids are just being thrust out there because the world has changed. Like, how do we address that and balance, like, yeah, look, I know there are some people that make a lot of money, but there's one, that is not a risk-free environment. And two, that's not the average person. And three, in pursuit of that fortune that is unlikely to come your way, you meaningfully expose yourself and your child over here.
Right. Well, and that's a great question. I mean, obviously, our society has changed significantly over the past few years, and certainly one of those changes is that parents are encouraged to make their children be in the public eye, to show off their talents, their skills, and then hopefully become stars or famous athletes, and they live vicariously basically through their child. Many of these mothers in particular, and no indictment against the ladies, but they're pushing their kids because it's what they would have hoped to do when they were children. They didn't get the opportunity, so now they're using their child to try to bring their dreams to reality. But I'll tell you what we also are faced with, and for me, I believe, and I probably sound a little old-fashioned, but our society as a whole has changed significantly in terms of how we perceive A, sexuality, and B, the role of a child in different avenues that parents may think are okay, but they're not, and they're pushing their kids too fast. One of the phenomena we're encountering now is we're encountering what we call familial trafficking of their children, which is parents and older siblings are putting their own children out on the street and arranging for them to have sexual encounters with adult males most often, and even females. And so to them, their child is just a revenue stream. To them, they don't see any issue with using them for the purposes of sexual gratification of strangers, and then continuing to pretend that they're their parent. Where's that coming from? A lot of it is motivated by drugs. A lot of it is motivated by greed because of the money that they can make. But it's also a sad statement of affairs that in this day and age, what's supposed to be a loving, trusting parent is really a manipulator of the child that they have and how they're using them for personal gain. And they have no scruples about the societal issue of what's normal, what's appropriate, what's acceptable when it comes to sexual activity.
That is just unbelievable to hear. Is that something that is being exacerbated or aided by the use of the internet with apps like, I don't know, I don't want to, like Telegram or things like that seem to be notorious for drugs, Snapchat, things of this nature. Are families essentially utilizing these technologies so that they can gain access to the Johns or whoever?
Mm-hmm. In many instances, that's exactly what they do. There are apps you can use to list yourself or someone for essentially prostitution. And so they know where to go for that, and they're not shy about putting their child out there in a photo and soliciting men to, generally speaking, men, sometimes women, to reach out and try to have an encounter with that child. And again, I just think that overall, when you look at media, you look at the movies, you look at TV today, sex is no longer the taboo that it once was. And how do you impress on a child that don't engage in that type of activity as a child, because chances are you're going to be a victim one way or the other. And so that's the problem. It's what we're moving towards. We can establish now that children on the internet are exposed to pornography by the age of 12. Children on the internet are a prime commodity in the sex trade, in the pornography trade. We've shown that up to 20%, that's 1 out of every 5 pornographic images on the internet, are of children. And so, when you're prioritizing or you're looking at children as a revenue stream, and regardless of their age, you're lowering the standard of what people should know about as far as how our society is going in that direction. And it's evil. It's plain and evil. And the sad part is it's not always even just for sexual activity. It's for highlighting or providing video and photographic evidence of children being tortured and in some cases even killed. And it's gone down to the level of children who are infants and toddlers. So how do you get your head around that? How do you deal with letting our society know, and particularly parents, it doesn't matter what age your child is, you need to be aware that this type of victimization is going on, and you need to be smart about educating your child, educating yourself, taking the precautions that you can take, and don't take it for granted that because your child has been raised a certain way that they're never going to be involved in anything like that. Because friends are a big influence. That's the other part, is peer pressure. Sexting is most common because of peer pressure. If you've got a kid that says, I'm not going to do that, her friends, or many times, or his friends, are going to say, well, we're all doing it. What's wrong with you? Are you too good to? And, if you don't, you're going to lose your boyfriend. You're going to lose your girlfriend. And so they're pressured into doing it. And once it's done, there's no going back. So I'm painting a rather negative image of the society that we're in right now, and the role that children are being placed in, But you have to deal with the facts up front. You have to deal with the reality of what's going on up front before you can say to somebody, now that you know, here's what you can do. And then they will then hopefully place the priority on it that they should. And one of the things we say to people, and we're very upfront, is look, now that you know all this, and now that we've given you all these tools, and you choose not to use them, you choose not to be proactive in the protection of your children, then you have no one to blame but yourself, because many parents are just ignorant and they don't know any of this. So therefore, they can say, well, I didn't know that, I didn't know that, and I didn't think my child would be a victim. When parents and adults leave our presentations, they've got so many tools and so much information that we give them in printed format. I mean, we give pages of handouts. Take it home. We give them the magnets, which has the nationwide toll-free number for the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children. We even tell them, look, if you've got something going on with your child and you're not sure if it's something you should report to the police, if it's something that's a crime, you can call them 24/7. They're the experts. They will tell you yes or no, or if not, here's the things you need to do to monitor it. Or if it is something that's clearly a crime, they'll help you get in touch with law enforcement. They will serve as a resource for you. And ironically, this latest case in Boise, they were instrumental in locating that child and helping to recover her. I don't know if you heard about it.
I didn't hear that one.
Yeah, this child was a runaway, and this was a case the Boise Police Department was handling. And they received information that the child was in Texas. So they went through the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children. They managed to access a database through them that actually showed them by cell phones and other methods where this child was in the city, in a city in Texas. They actually went right to the address and they found the child there, and she was being sexually trafficked, and they were able to arrest the suspect right there and then and return her to her home. And it was just, I think, 2 days ago that this occurred. So, and the point I'm making is not only kudos to the Boise Police Department, but also to the National Center, who coordinated with Texas law enforcement as well. So the tools are there. I'm passionate about it, obviously.
Right.
And there are times, that I think to myself, what kind of fun things could I be doing
well, you don't hunt or fish, so
that's exactly right. Or camp.
Yeah, right.
So no, and frankly, in all the time I've been doing this, I'm so caught up in it. I'm so passionate about it. I couldn't in good conscience walk away from it, because I'd always be thinking there's one more potential victim that we can save or prevent, and we're on a roll. I mean,
yeah.
So
one thing that I really want, that I talk to parents about and express is, look, the internet has made different forms of predators than existed 20 years ago. I mean, like, you have people from Russia, or like the Ivory Coast.
Yeah.
I mean, you have people coming in that 20 years ago had no capacity to victimize people. But
right.
One of the things that I find to be really important for people to realize is that cell phones and the internet have actually enabled otherwise well-intentioned, normal young men to become predators. And, I'm sure you hear about it. Every detective and law enforcement person I talk to, they all have stories about, the scams young men run on classmates or women that for some reason it's almost like the peer pressure thing. It's like, oh yeah, watch this. Like, I'll get a picture of Stephanie. Watch this. And, you find whichever app you like that allows you to communicate anonymously. Hey, Stephanie, I have a picture of you naked. Send me another one right now. Or, I'm going to blast this one to your entire church group. And they're overwhelmingly successful at getting Stephanie to then send a new naked picture of herself. Now they actually have naked pictures. And this is not something that, I've been able, not something I've been able to do. It's not something that was around when I was a kid.
Right.
Right. But I also don't think that I'm any better or worse than the existing kids. Like, I don't think that the teenagers now are worse people. I think they're being given access to this thing, which is pulling out their worst selves, their worst decision-making processes. They're inundated with examples all around them.
Right.
It's like, if you have 20 friends who are like, dude, I did it last week, just do it right now. I'd be like, well, let's see if it works. They're like, you can't get busted. This is the app. It disappears. There's no way they can find you. And they would be right. Not 100%, right? Like,
Right.
people can screw up and law enforcement can step in, but there are mechanisms that people are getting away with this all day long.
Right.
And that's so unfortunate, because like, we're giving something to our young men that is incentivizing a certain portion of them to engage in, or allowing a certain portion of them to engage in predatory behavior. And as damaging it is for our young women to be objectified like this and start sending out pictures and all these things, like, what does it teach our young men? That it's like, oh, you can just objectify women like this. Like, how are you going to have a cohesive family unit at 25 if for the last 10 years you've been getting naked photos of whoever,
Right.
And you don't care? And it's like, it's so damaging to both parties.
Right.
And it is one of those things I think about. I have 3 boys, and it is one of those things I think about. It's like, I do not want them to be tempted by their worst selves. Like, somebody who does this, if they didn't have the ability to do it, they wouldn't be doing it.
Right.
Right. We're handing them these things. And
Right.
again, not just victims, but creating more perpetrators.
Absolutely. And again, not to sound like I'm on the pulpit or that I'm that old, but I do feel it's a societal issue. We've I think tended to downplay the significance of sexual activity, nudity, that type of thing, where kids feel very comfortable engaging in that world, especially with the sharing of photos and videos. And like I mentioned, there's peer pressure that's involved. A lot of times what these kids don't realize is there's also statutes that make what they do criminal.
Oh, yeah.
And so, they go along thinking, well, what's the harm and what are they going to do about it? And it's just between us that are kids, and they don't realize that there are legal ramifications, that it can go from anywhere from a misdemeanor to a felony, depending on the age of the perpetrator. And that those statutes have been put in place to, if for no other reason, to say, look, this is unacceptable. You're accountable if you engage in it. And not only is there legal consequences, but we tell a story of a young woman who participated in allowing herself to be photographed either totally nude or partially nude. She was a candidate to enter the Air Force Academy. She was sitting in her final interview, and the interviewer turned his computer monitor around. He brought that picture up and he goes, "Do you recognize this woman?" And she realized for the first time that that photo that had been taken back in junior high school had followed her all the way up to now, where she had a career that she had hoped to pursue, and she was prevented from being able to do it because of the fact that that was on the internet. We have another female who was victimized who, in that fashion, who to this day cannot open a computer without fearing that they're going to see that image on it. So can you imagine growing in this world and trying to survive in some form of a profession and to be able to live your life without ever being able to open any type of device that will access the internet because you're convinced that you're going to see yourself on there in a compromising photo?
This is a long time ago, but do you recall Libby Holler? 2002, 2003. This was before. I remember this because a couple years following this, California passed a law on revenge pornography. Okay, which was
yeah, I think that's familiar.
right, and this this woman who was in college, she was like 19 or 20,
Right.
had a webcam, and this is like 2001 when she's doing this, or 2000. So it's like really grainy, like not iPhones and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but she had a
Mm-hmm.
camera, a digital camera of some sort, and she was in a long distance relationship. And she filmed herself doing all kinds of things in a series of videos and sent them to her boyfriend. And,
Mm-hmm.
hey, you're my guy. You'd never do
Right.
anything.
Right.
They break up and he spreads them on the internet,
Mm-hmm.
and like far and wide. And it was the first case or the first instance I had ever heard of where I was like, oh my God, because I mean, she was going to school in like Wisconsin. I heard about it down in California. Like
Right.
this thing spread nationally. And because of that, legislation started getting fired up where it's like, okay, we will prosecute you.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a certain degree of, legislation that was already in place, or statutes or whatever they were, but there was one that expressly came out that was the revenge porn law, where it's like, you cannot do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I bring that up to teens when I talk to them. It's like,
Right.
do you realize, like, this woman will never, ever, ever, like, went worldwide. And who
right.
knows when
That's
it
right.
will happen again, or how it will happen again, or where your pictures will end up, all of those things. So just to what you're pointing out, it's like, gosh, man, you might think whatever you think of the person you're sending these to. That's all going to be over once you guys break up.
Exactly. And the other thing I think you mentioned earlier was an app where you take a photo or some type of an image, and then after 2 minutes or whatever, it disappears.
Yeah, right.
Bottom line is, once you have that image on the internet, it never disappears. It can be accessed, and many times it is accessed by predators. So to take any comfort in the idea that you're on like a Snapchat or something like that and the picture will go away, it's fantasy. It's not reality. And as you mentioned also, the internet is worldwide. We know of cases of men who have traveled. In one case, a man from England flew here to Boise to have sexual intercourse with a teenage female that he'd met online. And they were engaged in that. And then he got on a plane and flew back to London. And ultimately, he was arrested by Interpol. But when you've got your image going all over the world, and you never know who is looking at it and what their intentions are going to be. I mean, we even talk about when you put an image on even vacation photos or graduation photos. Right. Don't take a photo where your address is visible. Don't put your child in a photo. And this seems extreme, but it's reality. Don't put them in their cheerleading uniform, and it identifies the high school. Anything that's identifiable, predators will use that to track that individual down and ultimately to attempt to victimize them, just because it was a very innocent photo placed by parents because they're proud of their child, and graduation pictures and so on. And what we say is, if you're going to do that, make sure that you have your photo app in a private mode, privacy mode, and make sure that if you're sharing it with anybody, you share it with them with the understanding you need to have this in a privacy mode as well. Do not start sending them to all of the family across the country, because ultimately there's a predator that's going to grab it, and then they can track that victim down and actually find where they live, find where they go to school, and attempt to victimize them. So, sad state of affairs.
Sad state of affairs. But God bless, we have people like you and other people at ICAC trying to educate parents and help law enforcement prosecute these people.
Right.
Because we're never parking this car back in the garage.
Oh, no.
Like the answer, the thing that I've been telling people is like, look, it's parents. It's parents. The only thing we can do is educate parents as much as possible. Yes, let's educate our youth. Let's try to protect our youth. Let's teach safe driving practices. But we know that kids are going to be kids. And the number one thing is to reestablish the parent as the primary protective mechanism in their household.
Absolutely. And to understand that prevention is the key. Our mission statement is prevention through awareness and education. The bottom line is that any law enforcement officer that you speak to who is involved in these types of cases will tell you that there's no way that they're going to make enough arrests in a fast period or period of time to make a real impact on the problem, because for everyone they arrest, there's 40 other victims out there.
Right.
And the other part of that is that it's only through awareness and education and prevention that we can hope to make a difference. So we're firmly committed to our mission and what we do and how we do it. And, we sponsor, we've adopted an electronic detection dog that goes out on search warrants and finds electronic devices that have been secreted by the perpetrator and behind walls and electrical outlets, and that typically on a search warrant, a law enforcement contingency would not find those devices, which is where the incriminating evidence is. But they're like a drug dog. You turn them loose in the house, they sniff the walls, they sniff the outlets, and they will alert when there's an electronic, like even as small as
like little USB sticks.
USB sticks, yeah, and those types of things. So bottom line is, it's another tool in the toolbox. It's an important tool. There are only 2 dogs in the entire state of Idaho, and they've been very effective in finding that evidence in order to arrest and prosecute these offenders. So we're supporting in that. We provide technology, the hardware and the software to agencies who are committed to investigating those cases, but their budgets don't allow for it. So we will purchase it. We will donate it to them free of charge, and make sure that everything that they have available to them is a tool that they can use to identify and apprehend these and prosecute these offenders. So we're not discounting the role of arrest and prosecution. I think that's always important. But the reality is like I said, unfortunately, the impact that type of approach has on the overall problem is much more minimal compared to what can be done through prevention and education.
That's beautiful.
So
I had no idea there were dogs such as that existed.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild, man.
Oh, yeah. No.
Good Lord. Well, Vic, thank you for coming in today. We've talked about a lot of things. I know this is not the most entertaining subject to talk about, but God bless it. It is important. It is important. Parents need to know the threat they're up against. They need to know what's out there. That's the only way we're going to keep kids safe and empower them to keep their house safe.
Right.
So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for all of your efforts. And I got to be honest, I'm kind of happy you don't like to hunt and fish, because you're a great resource for the state of Idaho.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I appreciate you having us on the show on behalf of the coalition. I appreciate the ability to share this information with the community at large. And I just want to say that it is important that we get the word out. So thank you for helping us to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let's do this again.
You got it.